Welcome to the 24th video in our series of projects using 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. The Anasazi pattern is by Sherry McConnell. We'll leave a link in the description below that'll take you straight to the pattern. The pattern has 3 color ideas on the back, 1 on the front, and a coloring page for you to try out ideas of your own. I had fun trying out a few ideas, but I think it'll look great in a variety of colorways. In the end, I decided I wanted to use a dark fabric for the background. I chose a very dark purple with some flowers, and white prints or prints on white for the stripes. From the background fabric, you need to cut 10 strips that are 8.5 by the width of fabric. It's ideal to straighten the edge before you make the cuts, and after I move the fabric a lot, I will re-straighten the edge to make sure that the cuts will still be perfect. I always make sure to double check as I'm cutting that I'm cutting in the right spot. You can use ruler markers to help you. Ruler markers are little stickers that you can put on your ruler that come off and are repositionable, and you can mark the spot that you need to cut in so that you have a visual cue. From the background fabric, you also need to cut 8 strips that are 2.5 inches wide by the width of fabric. I was only going to have a little bit of fabric left, so I just cut the whole thing into 2.5-inch strips. Whatever I don't use in the quilt, I can add to my 2.5-inch strip bucket. This strategy is probably why my strip bucket is so full, but I'm going to keep doing it because I like having those extra 2.5-inch strips. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you're enjoying our series of videos that uses 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. Once all the strips are cut, we will need to subcut the 8.5-inch wide strips into squares. You need to cut 40 8.5-inch squares from the 8.5-inch strips. Be sure to cut the selvages off before you cut your squares. You don't want any of that white to show up in your quilt top. From your 10 strips, you should be able to get at least 40 8.5-inch by 8.5-inch squares. If you have 42.5 inches of usable fabric in your strip, you might be able to get a 5th square from some of the strips. I did press that center section before I cut the square out, just to make sure I didn't have a bump in the square. I was able to save 2 whole strips of the 8.5-inch wide fabric by getting the extra square in the middle. Once all of your background squares are cut, you will need to draw a line corner to corner on the wrong side of each of these squares. Use a pencil or a marking pen to mark the lines, and I used my 12.5-inch ruler. I put the diagonal line on the ruler on the edge of the square and drew the line. Draw the line on all 40 of the squares. Next, you will need to gather the strips you want to use for the strip part of the block. I'm using plain white or prints that are on a white background. I didn't think I was going to have enough white strips or white background strips to make this quilt top, so I did go through my yardage and find some fabrics that I could cut up into 2.5-inch strips so I would have enough to go for the whole quilt. I threw the whole pile of white onto my sewing table and just started sewing strips together. The only strips I didn't use were the ones that were shorter than 8.5 inches. Everything else I tried to match up with something that was similar length and then just sewed them together. And when necessary, I would piece the strips together to make them long enough. Just seam them, open up the seam so it's flat, and keep on sewing. This is the mindless sewing I like to do, where it's just straight sewing, straight lines. I didn't really pay attention to which 2 fabrics I was putting together. I just picked up the first 2 I found and sewed them together. Sometimes multiple shorter strips would get sewn to one longer strip. You just want to sew until all the strips are used up. Make sure you're sewing with 1/4-inch seam allowances. Once all the strips have been sewn, cut them apart and head to the ironing board to press. Usually when I'm pressing, I will press it flat first, and then I will press the seam open or to one side. This time I just chose to press to one side. It doesn't really matter. You won't have anything to line up when you're making the blocks. As I'm pressing, I will also use that as an opportunity to pull out all the little strings that are in the middle. I'll either pull them out or I'll cut them. Once everything is pressed, it's time to head back to the sewing machine to make all of these sets of 2 turn into sets of 4. Find strip sets of similar length to sew together. You can also sew shorter sections onto a longer strip set. The bonus of sewing the shorter lengths onto longer strip sets is that you get a little more variety in the blocks. Once you've sewn through all your strips into sets of 4, then it's time to cut them apart and head to the ironing board to press. You will also want to use this time to cut the shorter sections to length that you sewed to the longer strip sets. I usually pressed flat first, and then I would press to one side. You could also press the seams open. Again, there's nothing to match up when you're making the blocks, so it doesn't matter which direction you put the seams. Once pressed, each of these strip sets should measure 8.5 inches wide. When you're done pressing, it's time to head to the cutting table. You will need to cut these into 8.5-inch squares. I used my 8.5-inch wide ruler, so this was really easy for me to just cut on 2 sides. For the shorter sections, it was easiest just to cut one at a time. I'd cut one side, flip it, and then cut the other side. Eventually, I did take some of the longer pieces and layer them on top of each other so I could cut multiple units at once. Cut with whatever method makes the most sense for you. If I had a small section left after cutting my squares, I would often cut them into 2.5-inch strips that I can use in another project. Any section that was smaller than 2.5, I would square it up as best I could and then just put it in my scrap pile. I'm sure I'll find a way to use it someday. When I cut multiple layers at once, I would offset the seams so they didn't all bunch up in one spot. This is easiest to do with a nice sharp blade. A total of 40 8.5 by 8.5-inch squares will be needed. A few of my strip sets weren't quite 8.5 inches wide, but it's okay. There's a little wiggle room in the next step to make them work. Once I got done cutting, I had about 43 blocks, so I had just enough, a few extras actually, and then I had these leftover 2.5-inch pieces and these scrap pieces. I had been a little worried that I wouldn't have enough pieces, and my backup plan had been to sew those extra little pieces together to make squares that were big enough, but fortunately I had just the right amount. The next thing you need to do is to count out 2 piles of 20 of those squares. When you sew them together with the background squares, half will be set horizontally, half will be set vertically. Set 20 of those blocks aside and just work on one type at a time. I'm going to sew 20 identical units. They're going to be the horizontal blocks first. So place a background square right sides together with a strip square and sew on both sides of that center line. You'll want to use 1/4-inch seam allowances for this step. I sewed all the seams on one side first, then I cut them apart and then sewed all the seams on the other side. If your squares made from strips aren't exactly 8.5 inches square, just center them on the background square, and then later on you will need to trim the squares to their final measurement. Once all the horizontal blocks are done, you want to make 20 of the vertical blocks. Make sure it goes the other direction from the previous blocks that you've sewn. In the end, you should have 20 that are vertical and 20 that are horizontal. Same thing for the vertical ones, you want to sew on both sides of the center line using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you get done sewing your blocks, do a double check to make sure you've got 20 of each. If necessary, you can take out some seams and make sure you have the right things sewn together. This is your last chance to make changes before we cut them apart. Cut on the center line for all 40 blocks. I recommend keeping your blocks in 2 separate piles, the horizontal block pile and the vertical block pile. To help speed things up, I would lay out 3 blocks at a time, kind of overlapping them a little bit, but not overlapping so I would cut into the corners of the other block. Cut through both piles, the vertical and the horizontal. Let's say you get done cutting through all your blocks and discovered you made all 40 of the blocks the same. Now, you won't have much variety in your quilt blocks as far as the direction of the strips, but the pattern will still work, so don't panic if you did that. It's going to be okay. Your quilt will just look a little bit different, and if you don't tell anybody, they won't know you made a mistake. That's one thing us quilters like to do, is point out all the mistakes we made in a quilt. So if they aren't a quilter that you're giving this gift to, don't point it out to them. They'll never know. I'm pressing towards the dark fabric. The pattern tells you to press towards the strip triangles, but since I switched the values on mine, I'm pressing towards the dark, which is the plain triangle. Once everything is pressed, head back to the cutting table. We're going to trim each of these squares to exactly 8 inches by 8 inches. You could use these squares exactly as they are, as long as they're all the same size. The other thing you'd want to do would be to cut off all those little triangles. I found it easier just to trim them to the 8 inch by 8 inch. That way I knew each piece was perfect. If you decide to skip this part, just trim the triangles and sew them together, your quilt top will measure a little larger than the stated 64.5 by 79.5 finish size on the pattern. As you can see, on some of these, I'm trimming a little bit more than others, and that had to do with the fact that some of my strip sets weren't quite 8.5 inches. I always love squaring up blocks before I put them into the quilt. That way I know that all of them are exactly the same. It does take a little extra time to square up the blocks, but I just put on some good music or a good book, and before I know it, I'm done. You will want to continue to keep them in the horizontal pile and the vertical pile. You will have 40 blocks in each of these piles. Start with one of the piles, break it into two groups. See, these are the same block. You have two piles. Now we're going to sew these two together to make like a flying geese block. These are made from the vertical blocks. We're going to sew the strip triangles to the strip triangles. Sew 20 sets of 2 blocks. I had the triangle points leading into the machine, and I would take a few careful stitches at the beginning, and then I could zip through the rest of the block. When I was sewing these sections together, the only thing I really paid attention to was that I wasn't sewing two exactly the same fabrics together. Once you finish sewing all 20 of those, set them aside. We'll need to press, but we're going to sew the horizontal sets next. This time, we'll be sewing background fabric to background fabric. Once you're done sewing this set of 20, cut them apart and head to the ironing board. It's time to press. For the units with strip triangles sewn together, press to the right block. I usually stack a few pieces on top of each other before I will move on to another set. For the units with the background triangles sewn to each other, press to the left side. Work with one set at a time. Pick 2 of the units and sew them together into sets of 2. I like to start in the corner where the seams are. I can take a few careful stitches at the beginning and then zip through the rest of the seam. You will end up with 10 sets of 2 units or 10 sets of 4 blocks. The next thing to do is to sew them into 5 sets of 4 units or 5 sets of 8 blocks. These will be the odd rows in the quilt. Using the same procedure, make the even rows of the quilt. Sew sets of 2 together and then sets of 4 together to get 5 rows of 8 blocks. When pressing the rows, all you need to do is follow the direction of the seam from when we sewed 2 of the blocks together. By pressing when we put the 2 blocks together, we set up the rest of the pressing for the entire quilt top. Each of the rows will be pressed the direction they need to be pressed to put the quilt top together. Now we're going to sew the odd rows to the even rows. Each place where the blocks meet, those seams should nest together to make sewing the rows together nice and easy. If desired, you could pin at each of the corners to keep everything in place. For these rows, you should be sewing triangles made from strips to each other. When sewing the rows together, I pressed after each seam. I find it easiest to press as I go along. Once you've sewn 2 of these rows together, you'll see the resulting chevrons that form. Keep sewing rows together, making sure that the chevrons all point in the same direction. For these final 4 seams, you should be sewing background fabric to background fabric. Once you're done sewing all the rows together, you'll want to give it a final pressing to make sure everything lays nice and flat. Measure the quilt top and cut your border pieces to match the measurements. Add the top and bottom first, then remeasure to cut side borders to the right length. I highly recommend pinning borders before sewing them to prevent stretching them as you sew. The pattern says the quilt should finish at 64.5 inches by 79.5 inches. If you need a larger quilt, you could use the same method that we used to add the first border to add a 5 or 6 inch outer border. With a 5-inch border, it would finish at 74.5 inches by 89.5 inches. Here's the quilt top before I added borders. If viewed at the right angle, it has a little bit of a 3D effect. It was right about here where I decided I wanted to just bind the quilt using the same fabric as the outer border. So I cut all my pieces to 2.5 inches. I used the leftover 8.5 inch strips that I didn't need at the beginning, and so I had just enough fabric. And when I'm putting my outer border and binding pieces together, I use my diagonal seam tape to help me piece it with that diagonal seam. As I'm sewing the pieces end to end, I don't have to do any special cut or make any special mark on the strips. I just trim the seams down to 1/4 inch and press the seams open from the wrong side. Diagonal seams pressed open will give you a lump-free binding. I quilted this quilt top on my long arm quilting machine, and I used 2 different color threads to quilt it. In the light areas, I used a white thread and followed the lines of the seams. On the dark areas, I used a dark navy thread that just disappeared into the fabric. For this particular quilt, I wanted the design of the quilt to stand out more than the quilting on the quilt. Using the 2 colors of thread does take a little more time when quilting, but it has the desired effect of disappearing into the quilt top. I had considered using a stripe for the binding fabric, but I'm glad I went with the background fabric just to tie everything together. For the backing, I just picked a lighter fabric with little figures on it. I thought it was kind of fun. And you can see the different colors of the quilting thread on the back side, but I kind of thought that this design hid it really well. I had a small pile of strips to add my strip bucket this time around, but it didn't fill up the bucket too much than it already was. It kind of looks the same as last month. I guess I need to start plotting my next project. We'll be back next month with another project for 2.5 inch strips. We hope you remember to give us a thumbs up if you like the video. Leave a comment for us, tell us how you're doing on your strip bucket, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!